Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jane Robinson, and I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Engagement and Place here at Newcastle University. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this annual and very topical Insights Sophia Lecture, General Election 2024. Is change really possible? So I'm just going to say a few words of welcome and a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Dr. Martin Farr, who is going to be introducing our guest speaker for this evening. So first of all, if I could ask you to put your phones on silent. Obviously, very happy if you do want to tweet about the event, but if you could put them on silent, that would be wonderful. We're not expecting a fire alarm, so if it does sound, please follow the instructions of our event stewards and make your way out of the building to the car park. As I was saying earlier, if you do want to use social media, the hashtag for X is hashtag InsightsNCL. Following the lecture this evening, I'm delighted to say that Pippa has agreed that she will take some questions. So there'll be a roving mic. So as we go through, do think of the questions you would like to ask, and hopefully we can accommodate those. Now, before we introduce our speaker, I'd just like to share some details about the Sophia Lecture. The lecture was established back in 1977. It was set up by the members of the Bosanquet family and friends, some of whom are here this evening, and a very, very warm welcome to you all. The lecture is held in memory of Ellen Sophia Bosanquet, daughter of Dr. Thomas Hodgkin, Honorary Treasurer of Armstrong College, and mother of the first Vice-Chancellor of the University of Newcastle, Charles Bosanquet, who was Vice-Chancellor when the university awarded Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. an honorary degree back in 1967. The lecture is delivered every 2 years by an eminent woman on a subject of their choice. Past speakers have included Mary Midgley, Jocelyn Bell-Burnell, Shami Chakrabarti, and Julia Unwin. And I'm delighted to say that this evening we will be joined by Pippa Crerar, political editor of The Guardian. And as I was saying before, a highly topical event, and it is fantastic to see so many people in the audience. And I believe we've also got some other people in an overflow room. So Pippa, you've clearly been a hot ticket. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Martin Farr, who co-chairs the Insights Lecture Group, and will introduce Pippa this evening. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Jane. And I'm doing this partly not least through the Insights public lectures, but also I teach history and politics. And so political editors of national newspapers are quite rare, and they're quite influential. Arguably, they have more influence than many ministers. Sometimes they can indeed change history without wishing to over-egg my particular pudding. I think we can say that's been the case with today's speaker, as I'll mention. Her career as a journalist began with the wonderful bonus of a degree from Newcastle University. BA English 1998, and indeed I met Pippa this afternoon outside the Percy building, where she had so many happy lectures, I'm sure, and seminars. Then Evening Standard political editor, and then at the only two reliably left-of-centre newspapers in this country in the last 50 years, the Daily Mirror and the Guardian. At the Mirror between 2018 and 2022, we have the events which I think we can say have shaped the last few years, including the hitherto unexamined state of Dominic Cummings's eyesight. And then the tendency we have in this country, the Americans don't do it, but we tend to add the suffix "gate" to scandals when they arise, which is usually embarrassing because the actual Watergate, of course, brought down a head of government. And so, of course, did Partygate. And our speaker this evening was the animating force behind that with her journalism. Scoop of the Year, she won. Political Journalist of the Year, she won from a multitude of organisations. Perhaps most appropriately for the Sophia, she was also voted Woman in Journalism's Woman of the Year at the British Journalism Award. She embodies, I think, many of the attributes of the great Daily Mirror man Hugh Cudlip and of C.P. Scott, the Guardian's presiding spirit, who commented that comment is free but facts are sacred. And you may notice on her Twitter account, her 500,000 followers see, "I always protect my sources." This reputation as a story getter and a story breaker is one of the reasons she has the profile that she has. And there's no one, I think, better equipped to guide us through what will be an extremely febrile year, after several febrile years, as we approach the 2024, probably 2024 general election. Please join me in welcoming Pippa Crerar.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you, everyone. It's great to be here, if not a little bit odd being this side of the lectern rather than that side of the lectern. And I'm actually looking around this audience really carefully because there was a cautionary tale in one of the newspapers this morning for people delivering speeches, just to make sure that you know who's in the room. It was about when Matt Hancock, the former health secretary, and I'm a celebrity star, depending on which generation you are, began a talk to the boys of Eton College, with this joke about how Jacob Rees-Mogg wasn't the most illustrious of politicians in the world. He received perhaps an inevitable payback when questions were open to the floor. I hope a situation which is not replicated after my speech. And a thin, bespectacled lad called Peter got to his feet, immediately strode out, and declared that his father was a good man in public and in private, especially Mogg Minor added, as he remained loyal to his wife. So I think Matt Hancock would have been suitably chastened. But as I was saying, it's great to be here again after so many years, and it really is so many years. As has been mentioned, I went to university in Newcastle and have very many happy memories of my time here. In my line of work, one of the questions that we get often asked is, where were you during the 1997 general election? I guess it's a bit like, where were you when Kennedy was shot? Or where were you for the moon landings? But for politics geeks. Well, my answer is here. And I'd love to be able to say that I was running around interviewing candidates or investigating manifesto pledges, but the truth is I spent most of that general election campaign flitting between the Robinson Library, I did get some work in, and the pub. I mentioned 1997 because we are, of course, in another potentially historic election year. And for the first time since Tony Blair's massive landslide 27 years ago, it looks like the Labour Party could end up beating an incumbent Conservative government into Downing Street. The sort of political change that seems to come along only once in a generation in this country. Although I do think I should add that when I was asked to do this lecture, which must have been end of last year, November maybe, October, November, I was asked to come up with a title. I thought, well, obviously refer to the election, and then I thought I'd ask the question, is change really possible? At that point, it did really look like the Conservatives could, if things went their way, be able to turn things around and still be in with a chance. Now, however many months later, of course, that looks like a much more unlikely prospect. Yet we're in a very different world from 1997, not just because of all the big political changes since then, the financial crash, Brexit and the pandemic, to name but three, but also because back then the economy was booming. Britain was a major international player, and there was a sort of a cultural buzz around in the air. And when people like me reflect on the run-up to that election, maybe because of that cultural buzz, we definitely view it through slightly rose-tinted spectacles. Tony Blair, whatever happened next, and obviously a lot did happen next, came riding into Downing Street on a wave of optimism and hope, right? Well, maybe not quite. The other day I was looking through some press cuttings from the run-up to 1997. I was quite surprised by what I found. I'd like to read you a couple of examples. So these are from The Times, The Observer, The Guardian. Although most people expect a clear Blair victory, they wrote, there is little evidence of positive enthusiasm for Labour or of high expectations of what the party would do in office. the safety-first minimalism of the Labour campaign fits the state of the nation. Sounds quite familiar, doesn't it? Labour's big lead in the polls has also meant a reversal of roles, went another. Tony Blair has been the front runner, protecting his position and quickly closing down possible areas of vulnerability. Again, it could potentially apply now. And the last one. The campaign, which is at the halfway stage, has been a turn-off so far for many. It may be partly a response to all the stories about sleaze, which could have produced a plague on all your houses reaction. So it's not quite how we tend to think of the run-up to 1997 all these years later. So maybe there are some similarities after all. However, there's still plenty of Labour people who worry about that the next election ends up having more in common with the 1992 election, when, of course, despite the polls' predictions, Neil Kinnock was dealt a crushing disappointment by John Major. I have, however, been very struck doing my job in these last few months by the low state of Tory morale, and by how open some actually quite senior Tory people are, ministers, cabinet ministers even, in sharing their views on the Prime Minister and what they believe their chances are at the next election. There's been a few who've been willing to put their heads above the parapet. For example, the former Cabinet Minister Simon Clarke, a Liz Truss ally, who set off a political hand grenade last month by predicting oblivion if Rishi Sunak remains in post. But there are far more Tories who share his view privately but aren't currently, at least, going to do anything about it. They can see which way the wind is blowing, but they believe it would be electoral suicide for the party to get rid of yet another leader this side of the election. All in all, the Conservative Party is not a very happy place right now. Its MPs seem addicted to the sugar highs of Westminster bubble dramas, of who is up and who is down, rows about political process, and far too much rhetorical heat around issues like immigration. And also in between the dramas, there is this, what seems like constant leadership plotting. In the last few weeks alone, we've had more bouts, or another bout of intrigue, as figures including Suella Braverman, Kemi Badenoch, as a Scot I should know that, and Penny Mordaunt jostle for position to take over from Sunak as and when he eventually goes. Braverman has been rolling out, and I forgive, apologies in advance for my language, what she describes as, or what her allies describe as her grid of shit, which is a series of bad stories designed to destabilise the Prime Minister. Badenoch and her supporters set up a WhatsApp group called Evil Plotters. Presumably ironic, but terrible timing. Mordaunt has been doing the rubber chicken circuit of constituency Conservative Party dinners. Even Liz Truss thinks she's in with another shot. Perhaps surprisingly, her term as Britain's shortest ever Prime Minister didn't put her off for life. This week she's been blaming the deep state for her downfall at a right-wing Conservative gathering in the United States. We've had a fair share of shock and awe in British politics over the years, particularly the last decade, from Brexit to the pandemic to the cost of living crisis. And it's felt more important than ever as a journalist to make sure that we properly hold those politicians to account. For a period that was really hard. Boris Johnson was in number 10, and Dominic Cummings, his special advisor, probably the most powerful prime ministerial aide that we've had with him, coming into office in 2019 and literally ripping up the rule book. It wasn't the easiest time to be a journalist challenging the government. So it was therefore with some trepidation that I took a call back from a contact back in spring 2020 telling me that Cummings had been spotted 260 miles away in County Durham, just down the road from here, during the COVID lockdown. It took us, and by us, I mean me and Jeremy Armstrong, my former Daily Mirror colleague, who I'm delighted is here tonight, just to embarrass him over there, weeks of old school journalism, knocking on doors, speaking to contacts, asking questions, all in the face of obfuscation, denials, and even, I'm afraid to say, lies from number 10, to be in a position to stand up the tip and be able to publish. The next day, a reader got in touch, to say they'd also spotted him in a pretty market town known as Barnard Castle. Some of you might be familiar with that one, and the rest of that particular story is, of course, history. I took a similar approach to the story back in autumn 2021 that grew into the Partygate scandal. I was shown what I've described as a metaphorical brown paper envelope. Not really a brown paper envelope, I just like the Watergate connotations, Watergate style connotations, but it was a piece of evidence that persuaded me to look into allegations that Boris Johnson and Downing Street officials had been holding gatherings, social gatherings in Number 10, while the rest of us were, for the most part, following the rules, the strict lockdown rules, that they'd imposed on the country. I had no idea at the time how that would play out politically. In fact, I remember walking to work, walking through Parliament on it was a Tuesday night we published, and on the Wednesday morning, before PMQs, there was lots of MPs around, and walking from the tube towards my office, you go sort of through the cloisters, and it's a great place to sort of bump into politicians and stop and chat. And from the course of the tube to the lift up to the press gallery, I bumped into 3 people, one political editor of a right-wing newspaper and 2 Conservative MPs. And each of them said variations in the theme. One of them was sort of like, well, great story, but it's a year ago. Is it going to have any cut through? Somebody else said, oh, it's such a Westminster bubble issue. Does anybody really care? And I remember thinking to myself, having had the experience with Jeremy of writing the Barnard Castle story, the Cummings lockdown story, that actually people really did care about it. So anyway, but we couldn't have seen how it was going to end up turning out. I also, unfortunately, I think, earned a reputation as Westminster's biggest party pooper, which a reputation I'm sure you'll be delighted to hear as a Newcastle alumni I've been doing my best to dispel ever since. After Boris Johnson's departure from Number 10 in 2022, I think we all wanted a little bit less drama in British politics. But when I joined The Guardian that August as political editor, I was a wee bit concerned that things would quieten down so much I wouldn't actually have anything to write about. The following week, Liz Truss was selected as leader of the Conservative Party. So I probably needn't have worried. It's an awful thing that what's good for journalism is often bad for the country, but it was quite honestly one of the most surreal periods of my time covering politics, and believe me, there's been a lot to choose from. Over a 4-month period, we had, I think it was, you'll remember this, Martin, 4 prime ministers, 3 chancellors, no, 4 chancellors, 3 prime ministers, other way around. The economy tanked and the ruling party imploded. I remember one Tory bumping into a Tory MP who rather memorably lamented to me that he felt like we were in Venezuela, but with drizzle, which was a very striking comparison. Rishi Sunak has definitely calmed things down a bit, although I suppose it's all relative. But the Tories have consistently been 15 to 20 points behind Labour in the polls and have more moments of high danger ahead, more by-elections, and crucially the local elections in May, and the mayoral elections obviously, which come at that time as well. And it feels they either need something to go very right for them or very wrong for the Conservatives, and neither of those things so far very right for them or very wrong for Labour, and neither of those things seem to be happening. And whatever Sunak tries, it doesn't seem to work. I was chatting to somebody from Number 10 earlier this week, and they said that they thought that the best way for the Conservative Party to turn itself round, was just to focus, sounds simple really, on governing well, to demonstrate competence and to demonstrate that they had a grip on what was going on. But that's really hard, right? When mortgage rates are still painfully high, so much so that one Tory MP claimed that he had struggled to get by on his £120,000 ministerial salary. And even though inflation, and even also obviously inflation started to fall, growth is more or less flatlining, and people are still really struggling with the cost of living. And there's this feeling that I pick up quite a lot when I'm out of Westminster, and I do try and get out of Westminster a lot because I think it's more, I think we can get caught up in that sort of bubble, and I'm interested in where the politics that's decided at Westminster kind of intersects with the real world, politics on the ground. And something that I've picked up quite a lot is that this sort of feeling that Britain isn't working anymore. And by that I mean that the economic model isn't delivering for people, however hard they work, and that many actually are worse off after the last 15 years of of wage stagnation. And even on the government's own 5 tests, things aren't going that well. You know, we're in recession, debt as a proportion of GDP is going in the wrong direction. NHS waiting lists aren't falling fast enough. Nobody seems to think that the Prime Minister's plan to tackle illegal migration, or stop the boats, as he calls it, can actually work. And the only one he's met is halving inflation, and then there's of course the question of whether that is actually down to government action. Yet you can still find people in Number 10 and around the Conservative Party headquarters who believe that they can turn it round. I mean, I guess if they don't, then there's no chance. And Sunak has told allies in recent weeks that he's fired up and up for the fight and really enthusiastic about it all. And that he's entirely confident that he can still win. I mean, I might think he actually sounds like he's getting quite good at the old Kendall Roy style motivational talk. What would another Conservative government even look like, though? I mean, it feels kind of, even though they're in power now, it feels kind of quite weird to try and project forward to see what they would do. And I think probably it would be much the same as now, but presumably with a much smaller majority, so therefore even more fragile, even more divided, and even more chaotic. And a more likely scenario is that, you know, they might end up with a hung parliament. But the Tories have few friends in parliament anymore, and the Lib Dems had their fingers burned during the coalition years. The DUP doesn't trust them post-Brexit. And the SNP runs headfirst into the unionist bit of the Conservative and Unionist Party, aside from anything else. So the worry among some senior figures in the Tory party is that Sunak's optimism is firmly misplaced, and that after 14 years in power, the electorate just aren't listening anymore, with public opinion about the Prime Minister and about the government already having reached the point of no return. And the problems they've faced have kind of mounted up to this sense that they aren't really control. And when that narrative starts to form, it's really difficult to break out of. Lots of Tories I speak to who are desperate to avoid that feeling of fatalism that crept in the Labour Party in some quarters in 2009 and 2010 ahead of that election when that was approaching, but they're really struggling with that. So what is the Tory strategy for the election? And can they ever turn it around? There's been several meetings over the last few weeks with a guy called Isaac Levido, who is the Tories' main electoral strategist. He worked with Boris Johnson during the 2019 campaign and was credited for that, in part, for that huge majority. And he's insisted to backbench MPs that the Labour vote remains soft, there's no great love for Keir Starmer, and that the don't knows are still up for grabs. They've opted for a 3-part strategy during the campaign. The first one of those is sort of like a presidential-style campaign around Rishi Sunak, because they still think that he can outperform, his personal ratings will recover and he'll outperform his party, so they should be making it about him. He began his premiership with, I think rightly, an attempt to persuade the public he was Mr. Stability, and after all the sort of tumult and turbulence of the Truss era, that he could run a competent government. When that didn't make a dent in the polls, he switched and he tried to present himself as Mr. Change, which is of course quite a reach when your party's been in power for so long. That didn't work either, so he then went for this kind of like this mix of the two, suggesting that his government would be strong and stable by bringing back David Cameron to secure the Tory heartlands, while at the same time, I mean, literally days later, doubling down on his Rwanda policy, which they want to do to try and hang on to their 2019 Tory voters. It's no surprise that voters are a bit concerned about who Rishi Sunak is. Second, first being the presidential style campaign, second, a ground war, as we call it in Westminster politics, based around local issues. So the difference being that the ground war is one you fight very much sort of on the doorsteps, still with leaflets through the door, through targeted local ads, through local media, as opposed to the air war, which is the national campaign that's fought out across, leadership debates and in the national newspapers and on the national broadcasters. So a ground war based around local issues like low traffic neighbourhoods, for example, which is along the lines of the campaign which they fought and won in Boris Johnson's old seat in Uxbridge for the by-election there. Yet there are only really a handful of seats across the country where there is such a sort of a prominent local issue that it could win or lose a constituency during a general election campaign. And third, They want to counter the threat of the Reform Party and the Tory right on that flank. And they're terrified that Nigel Farage will ask Richard Tice, who's the current leader of the party, to step aside so that he can lead, and that Farage would be a much more formidable foe. It is worth noting, though, that Farage doesn't currently look like he'll run, and I'm hoping I'm not going to wake up to the news tomorrow that he's decided he's going to stand in Clacton, but wouldn't be the first time I've been wrong. But people around him say that he's still scarred from losing, I think it's 7 contests in a row now that he's lost, so that they think he thinks he can make more of an impact, both as sort of a social media influencer on YouTube, but also with the US election campaign, which is running timing-wise alongside. And also, the polling suggests that a large chunk of those new Tory 2019 voters wouldn't necessarily, if they decide, they currently say that they don't know how they would vote, and that it wouldn't necessarily go back to the Conservatives. Some might go to Reform, but some might also go to Labour, and some might stay in that I don't know category right up until polling day. So what sort of campaign are we likely to get? Sadly, I think there's going to be a lot of division and polarisation. So I think we should prepare ourselves for a lot of tough, even uncomfortable rhetoric on issues like immigration. And also on, I was reluctant to use the phrase culture wars, but that's kind of become the shorthand to describe them. Issues like trans rights, around net zero and climate change, where the Tories think that they can create dividing lines with Labour, which might do them some favours in some of the seats that they want to hold on to, that they won last time for the first time. The biggest challenge, however, in fact, all parties' biggest challenge is going to be, of course, and ultimately what decides when the election takes place, is going to be the economy and who the public best trusts to handle it, to run it. Jeremy Hunt's already delivered one tax cut by taking 2% off national insurance at the autumn statement. And we've had so much expectation management over the last few weeks about how there may not be enough cash for him to do what the Conservative backbenchers are clamouring for and to deliver another, although I think our expectation is that there will be a further cut on national insurance, probably of about 1%. That would be my prediction for next week's spring budget. And we're also likely to see fuel duty frozen again. But I think that things like cuts to the main rate of income tax, which of course Sunak during the leadership campaign said he wanted to cut down to 16p, so a big chunk off it, the basic rate. Cuts to inheritance tax, stamp duty, and extending the free childcare offer are likely to be shelved for now. I wouldn't be surprised if at least one of those, inheritance tax, appeared in the election manifesto, though. It seems to touch the right buttons for a lot of Conservative politicians. But those Tories calling for big tax cuts, believing that it's going to be the only way that they could win the next election, I think are going to be disappointed after Hunt warned that they couldn't afford it as a result of, as he described to Cabinet, major structural weaknesses, or the major structural weakness of low productivity. I'd say watch this space on that one. We're expecting a productivity review from the Cabinet Office shortly, which is basically shorthand for more cuts. Yet Sunak has also been warned against launching a fresh austerity drive. And I always think back to 2015 when George Osborne came in and Cameron and Osborne had promised to continue with austerity, and very quickly realised that they couldn't do that and had to inject cash into public services because it was unsustainable. They were on their knees. I think Sunak, he's been warned about that. Frontline services, including those delivered by councils, obviously been in the news a lot recently, are really struggling, and living standards have suffered their longest sustained fall since records began 70 years ago. So it's a pretty difficult, sadly pretty bleak economic picture. Over in the red corner, however, things are substantially cheerier. Every time I bump into a Labour politician or a senior aide, they preface our conversation, we were talking about this earlier, Martin, they preface our conversation with, well, we might not win, but, and then go on to talk about what would happen if they do win. We can't take anything for granted. Obviously, complacency is a bad thing. And then they launch into this discussion about the months ahead. And as the days go by, it looks increasingly likely that Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister within the year. I mentioned that, the subject for this lecture, I thought it would be interesting to weigh up, from my perspective, how likely it was for a Labour government to take over for the first time in 14 years. And it sort of almost doesn't feel it's worth asking that question now. Not necessarily, I have to say, because people are so won over by Labour or Keir Starmer or indeed any of the other opposition parties, but because they're just really fed up with the Conservatives. I'm not in the business of making firm predictions, however. I've learnt to my cost that that's a really bad idea for a political editor. And one thing we've all learned from the last 10 years or so is that British politics is extremely volatile. And that party loyalty, as it used to exist, has really firmly eroded. And there's, a real dislike and mistrust, I think probably is the right word, of the political classes and of what goes on at Westminster. And that events, be they wars or pandemics or financial crises, can turn up out of nowhere. Yet Labour's poll lead is showing little sign of stalling, and they've won a swathe of recent by-election victories. We'll see how tonight in Rochdale goes. Obviously, a different set of circumstances there. We might come back to that in the questions. But Labour have won all these by-elections, including in red wall seats, of the sort they lost in their 2019 election drubbing. And crucially, actually, in Scotland, they won the Rutherglen by-election with all that could mean for the party's revival across the whole of the UK. The party may look like a government in waiting, but actually of all the Labour people I speak to, Starmer himself is the most cautious. Maybe that shouldn't come as a surprise. He told me recently that he doesn't want the party to look complacent, or the word he uses is giddy about the prospect of power. And he points out that his strategists say that Labour would require a huge swing of 12% to get a majority of just one. And that's bigger than the 10% secured by Tony Blair in his 1997 landslide. I do still think that Labour have got a long way to go to win over those don't knows that we were talking about before. But I also think that the 2019 result was actually a bit of an artificial baseline, with the unique factors of Brexit and Jeremy Corbyn that just won't be issues this time round. Labour still's got a lot of work to do, particularly in spelling out what they would do in government and also how they would do it if they won, so that those early years aren't wasted. Think back to Tony Blair taking over in 1997 and subsequently reflecting on the fact that he felt those first 2 years they didn't move fast enough. In the days after he took over as Labour leader 3 years ago, I had a chat with Starmer during which I pressed him on what his overwhelming majority would be should he ever make it into power. This felt like a distant prospect, but he didn't say fixing Brexit or reforming the NHS or any of the other dozens of issues he could have quite legitimately picked at that time. He simply said to win the next election. Only then, he explained, could you actually do anything. At the time, that seemed like it would be an impossible task. Boris Johnson was squatting over British politics and looked set to be in power for a decade. Starmer admitted that Labour had a mountain to climb, but insisted that he had a plan to get to the summit. And he has, whatever people think of him, I think most people would agree, transformed the party and taken to the Tories, his fight to the Tories, in just one term, against the odds. At his party conference in the autumn, he began setting out the last part of what he wants to do, which was setting out what Labour would do differently, given he knows he can't just rely on winning on the back of Tory woes. Labour has started to explain, or has tried to start to explain, be interested to hear from you whether it's been effective, to the public, if not them, the Tories, why us, Labour? Yet I bet if you ask most people walking down the street, they still wouldn't know. Labour's got this substantial mission document which they published and keep referring to, and it sets out what they want to do in key areas. But as far as I can work out, that hasn't been effectively communicated to the public, and people still don't know what, as they put it, Labour stands for. It is true that lots of people don't pay much attention to politics, and frankly, we've all got a lot of other things on in our lives day to day, and you lot are probably the exception by the fact that you're here. But a lot of people sort of zone out until that 6-week period in the run-up to a general election, when it's on the telly day in, day out, and it feels much more immediate. But it also feels that people don't really know that much about Starmer himself either. I often get asked what he's like. Is he boring? What does he really believe in? This is becoming an increasingly popular one. Is he, on parts of the left, is he actually any different from Rishi Sunak? And his frustrated advisors bang on about how they wish people could see the real Keir. And it is true that the gap between perception and reality on him is quite wide. But I also think that, like most people, he's complicated and he's filled with paradoxes. As his biographer, Tom Baldwin, who's just written, this book's just come out, I was reading it the other day, I think sheds light on him that I was quite surprised. I felt that I probably knew quite a lot about him, but I learned quite a lot of new things. He's the most working class leader of the party in a generation, but he's also the first in its history of having the prefix Sir to his name before he came to power. Or before he got the job, rather, not in power yet. He's a private and cautious man by instinct, yet he's chosen to place himself in the white light of public scrutiny, while taking some big political risks, including one that ended the career of his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn. He likes to think decisions through and sometimes changes his mind, but he's also been incredibly ruthless in overcoming some of the most polished or popular opponents, both in his own party and in the Conservative Party. But of course he's fallible, and he's made a number of unforced errors. For example, his shocking comments over Gaza and Israel last year, or more recently, the time it took him and the party to get to the place they wanted to on their £28 billion Green Prosperity Plan. Yet it remains the case that he's pulled Labour from 20 points behind to 20 points ahead, and that's not all down to people being fed up with the Tories. While much of the focus has been on convincing the public that they'd be responsible stewards of the economy, Starmer insists that, and as Starmer insists that most of his efforts so far have been on offering that reassurance, both on the economy but also on national security, they say he does understand, or he says he does understand, that he needs to provide hope as well. If they want to get a decent majority and a second term, which frankly they would have to do given the current climate, to be able to do any of the things they say they want to do, then they need to win big, and they won't do that if they don't inspire people. Yet after years of over-promising but under-delivering on things like levelling up and Brexit, the public is understandably sceptical of politicians' commitments. And that's not just Tory promises. The distrust is focused on parties from right across the spectrum. The other problem is that the economic backdrop means there's very little money for big spending commitments, even if they wanted to make them. And that particular problem seems to be growing every time the government makes a new spending or tax commitment. Senior Labour figures are grumbling quite a lot about a scorched earth policy at the moment. Their £28 billion green plan I mentioned, basically an industrial strategy by another name, it was delayed once, and then they got to the point where they ditched the price tag. Instead, say they want to focus on the policies like clean power and so on instead. But that was another big battle within the Labour Party, and some there were arguing that Starmer was too concerned about avoiding Tory attacks on things like tax. You're going to have to put up taxes to pay for it type thing. And he should have defended his flagship policy instead, or else he seriously risks looking like he doesn't stand for anything. And nor would the Labour government be able to ride to the rescue, as some in the Labour Party see it, of public services anytime soon. They've got incredibly narrow room for manoeuvre. Reeves has, I think, relished taking on this role as sort of Iron Shadow Chancellor, as she sees herself. And she's read the Riot Act to Labour front benchers, telling them not to make any unfunded spending promises before the next election, as that could be a gift to the Conservatives. But there are, of course, issues like two-child benefit cap and so on, which that's really difficult for Labour people to hear. She's become an increasingly significant figure in the Labour movement, in the Starmer project. Their offices are just down the corridor from one another in Parliament, and they talk often. I think she's probably, of all the politicians, she's the one he works with most closely on planning for the election. And I think if they do make it to power, I'd expect them to have a more collaborative relationship. There shouldn't be fallouts. I mean, we'll be reporting fallouts, but a more collaborative relationship along the Cameron Osborne style, rather than some of the tensions that existed, the rivalry that existed between Brown and Blair. She's also central to Labour's attempts to try and reassure business and voters that they would be careful stewards of the economy. They've talked quite a lot about what they will do. They haven't talked much about what they will do for business, but they've talked quite a lot about what they won't do. And at its heart, it's not rocking the boat. They argue that after Boris Johnson's colourful language and business, I'm sure you can remember what he said without me repeating that particular one, and Brexit and the Truss era, that what city and businesses are craving is stability. At the last conference, she started to tell a story about how Labour would be different in government, setting out her vision of what she calls securonomics. It's kind of like a Biden-esque economic nationalism that would grow the economy. The bottom up and the middle out is the phrase. Not quite sure I know what that means, but maybe some of you do. I guess they'd just be hoping that they get more credit for that than Biden seems to have done for the changes that he's made in the States and improving the economy there. Her principal offer in the economy is to secure the highest sustained growth in the G7 with jobs and productivity right across the country. But again, there'll be people in the audience, I'm sure, that will know better than I whether that is actually achievable. It seems like a big ask at the moment when we're in recession, doesn't it? We had a little bit from tax, but things like making private schools pay VAT, scrapping the non-dom tax, raising stamp duty on overseas buyers, removing private equity tax breaks, but very little detail about what tax changes they would make to bring in serious money, to bring in serious funding. And in fact, they've actually resisted talking about, they've ruled out lots of tax changes. Starmer's ruled out any income tax rises or introducing any sort of wealth tax at this stage, maybe by equalising capital gains or something like that. He says he didn't come into politics to raise taxes on working people, and he thinks that realpolitik and the fiscal caution, which definitely exists at the top of the Labour Party, mean he'll stick to that. But again, it means they'll be coming into power with one funding stream cut off right from the start. There are, of course, other parties, and I'm sure some of this will come up in questions, so maybe we should leave that till then. But as a Scot, I follow very closely what's happening with the SNP and watching the realignment in Scottish politics, which is sort of like a coming together of the implosion of Nicola Sturgeon and she's an incredible brand in Scotland, even over and above people that supported independence or were fans of the SNP. She was obviously very charismatic and powerful politician. So Nicola Sturgeon implosion, that sort of fairness, I suppose, the sort of political cycle that people after a decade in power, people are looking at the SNP and thinking, things aren't as good as I thought they'd be, it's somebody else's turn. And the alignment of that with what's going on at Westminster, with the Conservatives struggling and a resurgent Labour, with a charismatic leader north of the border in Anas Sarwar. I think the whole sort of there's no route to power for Labour that doesn't run through Scotland thing is a bit overstated. Didn't happen for Tony Blair, didn't happen for Clement Attlee, but nevertheless it could bring them a couple of dozen really much needed seats. And then of course there's the Lib Dems on the Tories' left flank in the previously safe Tory heartland. So I think we'll be keeping our eye out on election night for Michael Portillo moments, maybe a Michael Gove or a Jeremy Hunt even, with their Surrey constituents deciding to opt for the Lib Dems instead. Some people argue that the main parties should work together, so the parties on the left, progressive parties, so Labour, Lib Dems, Greens, Plaid Cymru, there's others, and the SNP to get rid of the Tories, and suggest that their candidates should stand down in certain seats to give the one with the best chance the chance of running. But putting aside for a moment the fact that I think is unlikely that any of the parties would be likely to agree to this. I mean, why would Labour, frankly, at the moment when it's on course to win anyway? Voters hate being told what to do by politicians, and I think my fear would be that it would amplify the feeling of disconnect that already exists between people and Westminster, that lack of agency that people already feel. And frankly, voters have shown that they can do a pretty good job of working out tactical voting themselves. I mean, just look at the last few by-elections in previously safe seats where Labour or the Lib Dems have emerged as the clear winner. Coming back to the title again for a moment, it's not up there again, sorry, but about whether change is possible. I mean, I think probably it's moved on from thinking about change as a change in governing party, which was how I first envisaged this lecture would go, to thinking about how much change a Starmer-led Labour government can actually deliver with all the constraints they have and their natural caution, and whether we're going to see them, for example, sticking for the first 2 years to Tory spending plans in the way that Ken Clarke, that Tony Blair, Gordon Brown did with Ken Clarke, Starmer gets a lot of criticism from the left for being, a Tory in Labour clothes. I keep thinking back to that moment when he said that it was all about winning the election, and only when you win do you have the power actually to make a difference and to make a change. I'm an optimist. I'm definitely a half glass full person, so I like to think that should they win, that they will be addressing some of the really sort of systemic issues that exist in Britain. They've talked about having a revamped Race Relations Act. They're very conscious of the impact of austerity on public services. Education and sort of building opportunity for people right across the country is a huge issue. Devolution of power, not yet fiscal power, watch that one, but I think these things are all potential changes. And then, of course, I'll just very briefly touch on the international backdrop, because if none of this is in isolation, right? We have numerous elections this year, not least in Russia and India. We can probably predict which way they will go, but also in the States, and the fact that potentially we'll have a US election at the same time as a UK election. How does that impact on how the campaign runs? It's bound to be much more polarised, touching on populism much more in the States. Does that mean that our election becomes grubbier as a result? I mean, I hope not. And then what does that look like for potentially Labour government dealing with a Republican Donald Trump-led administration in the White House? Not necessarily all good change. I thought I'd just conclude about when the next election might be. And that's, of course, the $64,000 question right now. Now, there's a freelance photographer, a guy called Steve Back, who spends an awful lot of time in Downing Street, standing in the press pen opposite the door, and he set the hairs running this morning, in fact, by tweeting that a prediction that Sunak will announce a May election on March the 28th, which is the last date that he could announce a May election. How would he know, you might ask? Well, Steve made his name by snapping documents that were left carelessly on display by unsuspecting politicians and officials popping in and out of that famous black door. As a result, there's actually a framed notice in the hall in Downing Street as you walk out the door, which says, "Please remember you may be photographed. Please cover any documents you may be holding." So far today, he's remained tight-lipped about what actually he's seen this time, but it proves the fact that nobody actually knows. Sunak said that his working assumption is that the election will be in the autumn, and that's certainly when Tory party strategists are aiming for. I think he's probably hoping against hope that he can begin to deliver like the green shoots of economic recovery, inflation falling down to 3%, 2% even by the autumn, that he'll be able to get off one flight to Rwanda, symbolic, before polling day. And he gets credit for putting Brexit to bed with his Windsor Framework deal. And of course, he, like most other politicians, like most other prime ministers before him, will want to stay in number 10 for as long as possible, not least so that he's got time to secure a legacy of one type or another. I'd imagine that 2 years as prime minister on your CV is a lot more impressive than 18 months, as he heads off into the Californian sunshine for his high-powered tech job. But it remains to be seen, of course, whether he'll be able to wait that long. There are other factors at play. If the economy looks like it's only going to get worse, bills are still high and hundreds of thousands of people struggling when they come off their fixed rate mortgages, will we get another few months of small boat crossings? Would another set of terrible local election results in May put Sunak's own position at risk in the Conservative Party? Does Nigel Farage return to frontline politics? If the answer to those questions is yes, then he might not have a chance but to go early. That photographer outside Downing Street might be right after all. Before I wrap up, and because we're talking about elections, I thought I'd remind you of some of the most memorable political slogans in recent decades, just to get you in the mood for what we're likely to see in the coming months. The Tories' "Labour isn't working" in 1979, you'll remember that very striking poster. Tony Blair's "New Labour, New Life for Britain" in 1997. Not Flash, just Gordon in 2010. That's one of my favourites, that one. The Vote Leave's "Take Back Control" in 2016, and Boris Johnson's "Get Brexit Done" at the 2019 general election. We don't know yet what Starmer and Sunak's slogans are likely to be this time round. No drama, Starmer, for the Labour leader, perhaps? or at least I'm not Truss for the Prime Minister. But time for change is a powerful sentiment, so we should probably prepare ourselves for exactly that at the next election, whenever it is.